Okay, hello. Welcome to our second module on ecosystem services. I want to talk about we're still talking about ecosystem services this week, but I want to talk about a short case study here, what they did in Toronto to look at the associations of tree density and some other variables here. So I want to walk through this study a little bit, and it won't take that long. So they had some data here. So they're starting with tree data, and what they had here was you're looking at the city of Toronto here and the street trees. So just trees that are planted sort of along streets, like in between that area between the street and the sidewalk, usually called like the right of way or something like that. Those are what are considered street trees, and those are almost always managed by the city government or the local government. And so it's good to understand what's going on with that population because that's something you can control from the local government standpoint. So you're looking at those mapped out as well as parks here. So we have street trees and parks, and they might have had some. Uh, I think they had some data on the trees within the parks as well. So what they were able to do with that data is calculate some percent of canopy cover, and that's what you're showing here based on that data. And there's definitely some trends. You know, you're seeing some areas that are really highly dense, and other areas that are not dense. We've already talked about some of the implications for not having much tree cover, or reasons why you want to have more in terms of things like stormwater benefits and air quality benefits and things like that. But they wanted to look at some different potential benefits. And so they had data on the urban forest, but they also had some data on the city itself. Now, what you're seeing here are, I think these are block groups were included in the city. So they're sort of coloring these, whether these block groups, the colored ones were in the study, though the white ones were not in the study. Um, and if you're not familiar with what a block group is, it's a sort of just a unit of organization, of like aerial organization. So like, you know, we have the whole country, and then you have states, and then you have counties. And I think, you know, everyone's kind of familiar with that level. And counties, I think, are probably the smallest unit that people are usually familiar with. But there's smaller ones. There's like census tracts, and there's census block groups that I'm pretty sure we're seeing right here. And it's basically like the neighborhood level. Like that's sort of what they're trying to quantify here. But it's just a smaller grouping of land than the county. And there's all sorts of data that gets collected along with this when the census is done. And so, you know, we're just wrapping up a census. So hopefully you did fill out your information on that, because this is just one small tip of the iceberg example of why having that sort of information is really important, and why, you know, or how we can use that data to figure out what's going on in cities, and not just cities, really in the entire country. It's really, really crucial to have accurate information. So this probably came from the census, I'm guessing, these block group data, and they had a lot of socioeconomic data. And so let's sort of look at what they had here. So what they wanted to do was figure out the relationship between health factors, like how healthy do you perceive yourself as being, and then how healthy are you actually? Like, what's your cardio metabolic conditions? Do you have any of those mental disorders, or other disorders that people might report? What's that association with demographics and tree density? And really, this study wanted to know um, what's the relationship between health factors and tree density, street tree density, and other types of tree density. But you're going to want to control for other factors while you're doing that, because obviously, street tree density is not the only thing that can influence a person's health. Like age is probably the number one thing that could influence somebody's health, right? Like as we get older, we tend to have more health conditions. And so there's a number of things that you want to control for if you're going to do that in someone's sex, like whether you're male or female. We're talking about sex, not necessarily gender, and that would be interesting to include here. But this was just using sex, but what we know, different sexes are predisposed to different types of diseases and different types of health conditions. So you want to control for that. Education is kind of a little bit of muddy water in education, but it's something you want to include because, for one, being educated, you probably are aware of more health conditions than a person who hasn't had as much education. You might be more aware of the risk factors. You might be like your behaviors might be different and lifestyle factors that go into this, but it's going to be related to other things too. Your diet obviously has a role in your health. And what health conditions you do or don't develop. Income, certainly, and this is a very important one in countries like the United States where we don't have universal health care. Your income is going to have a direct impact on what health services you have access to. So that's going to influence the onset and development of certain types of conditions. And then the income of people around you as well. What sort of neighborhood do you live in should probably be correlated to those things too. So you want to control for all these things, even if you're not studying them specifically. These are things you want to control for so that you can figure out what specific impact these things are actually having. You don't want to be able to say like, yes, it looks like street tree density is important, but it might be because people who are older live in areas with more trees. You don't want that sort of confounding factors to be in there. So they're controlling for a lot of factors here, and so they got all this data from the census data, and that's then another reason why that's so important. And wanted to know what was the relationship for these health factors. So what did they find? Um, they did something called I can never say this, canonical correlation analysis. And I'm not going to get into what that means, but basically what they're trying to determine is what's the relationship between these sets of variables, those ones that we just looked at, and these health variables on the other side here. And what they do is sort of create different combinations of the variables and see which combinations are explaining, if we pair age and health perception and age and cardiometabolic and age and this and all these different combinations, which ones are yielding the strongest correlation. And it's not it's a good analysis for this good approach for this type of thing. And basically the numbers range from 0 to 1, and 0 would be no relationship and 1 would be like absolute relationship. And so they're getting a 0.45, and we're not going to get into the stats of this, but basically that's a fairly strong correlation. And what you're seeing here is the correlation specifically with the individual variables. And not surprisingly, for this combination, they did different they show a couple different combinations here, but for this one, the first one that yielded the strongest overall correlation, age was most highly correlated with these conditions, specifically with cardio metabolic conditions was the most. So age was the most for all of these, and among these, cardio-metabolic conditions were the ones that were associated the most with all of these, if that makes sense. But this isn't really that surprising. I mean, we know in just sort of basic sense, like as people get older, they experience more health conditions, and so that's not really surprising. But other types of, other things were showing up here a little bit. These aren't really strong correlations, but sex might be related to certain types of conditions here, and also other types of tree density, not necessarily street tree density. But this was only one combination here. It yielded the strongest one, and basically the takeaway here is that age has the most is most associated with these things. But they checked other combinations as well. And basically this combination where you're seeing basically what's going on here is that there are underlying influences that these other things have, not just age. Like age, if you control for it, income is also very highly related to first of all, your health perception, and I'll come back to that in a second because it's kind of interesting. But area, income, education, diet, street tree density, and both of these, definitely street tree density is seeing some strong correlations with this overall set. This overall correlation was lower. So obviously, age is the most important thing, but if you control for that, there's still some other things going on here. What's going on here is kind of interesting though. It's this health perception, and it's basically like how healthy do you perceive yourself as being? Um, and what they found is that people who have higher incomes and have higher educations and maybe have better diets and live in areas that have more street tree density perceive themselves as being healthier than other people. Now they may not be, especially if they're not living in areas, maybe you live in a high income area and you have high education attainment, but maybe you don't actually live in an area that has high street tree density. You may not be getting all of the benefits from that. And so maybe you're not as healthy as someone in another neighborhood who has a little bit less income but has higher street tree density. So that's kind of what's going on there. It's a tricky sort of graph to figure out here, but basically this combination, if you're controlling for age, then there's other factors as well, and a big one is the density of street trees, and to a lesser degree other types of trees as well. And so sort of the big takeaway here, they also did a regression analysis, and I'm not going to get into the stats on that, but a big takeaway here was that improving health perception improving health perception and decreasing cardiometabolic conditions by planting 10 more trees per block. In the study, it was equivalent to increasing the income of every household in that city block by more than $10,000. So basically what they're saying here is that if you plant at least 10 more trees per block, which really, is 10 trees, that's not that much. The health benefits that people receive from that is like adding $10,000 to their annual income. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of benefits, and it definitely costs less than $10,000 a year to plant 10 more trees. So it's a big return on your investment for your citizens if you just add 10 trees to a block. On average, you're going to get $10,000 in benefits for those people. And I'm not going to go too much into the rest of it, but they do speculate because they weren't really studying how this stuff happens. They were just studying what are the trends, and they speculate a little bit. And there's some evidence to support like having trees in your neighborhood decreases stress levels, and that can have health benefits. And we know it decreases air pollution, so that can decrease asthma and maybe things like COPD if you've been a smoker, and other sorts of things, lung cancer and other lung diseases, and cardiovascular stuff as well. Lots of benefits from having cleaner air. There's also maybe, if your neighborhood is nicer, then maybe you're more likely to get outside and walk around in it. And there's also, like income stuff, like maybe people who have more money are just able to live in these areas. That's sort of a thing that's sort of hard to tease out. And if you have more money, then you probably have access to better healthcare and things like that. But they were able to control for some of that, and regardless, adding trees adds benefits. So really important results there, and in terms of understanding the types of benefits, the types of public health benefits that come from having more trees. So I wanted to walk through that a little bit. And there's some additional readings here. So we're still talking about ecosystem services. So there's a really great article it was a Science Friday thing, if you're familiar with those. But I'll link to that. And it's about the trees in New York City. And there's a really cool data visualization that I'll have you look at, where they mapped out in a really cool way sort of some similar variables that we just looked at, but for New York City rather than in Toronto. And then also there's another reading here where we're going to talk about some of the disservices. So we're talking about ecosystem services in terms of like what are the benefits we're getting from having trees in our cities. But it's not like trees are always a good thing. I mean, I think they're a net positive, but that doesn't mean everything associated with them is good. There are some bad things or negative associations with having trees too, and we tend to call those disservices. So this is a really great study that sums up some of those and talks about, if we want to quantify the benefits we get from trees, then we need to understand some of the drawbacks and understand the pros and cons both really well, so we can make our case really well. And this study does a really good job of that. So keep working your way through the module as usual. And you know what I'm going to say here. Go vote. There's 1 week left. Well, depending on when you're watching this, from the day I uploaded it, and it's Tuesday. There's a week left of voting before Election Day. So get out there and vote. Get your friends to vote. Get your friends to vote, and their friends. Just go vote. I've probably said it enough. So, okay, keep working your way through the module.